The Stone Zone, entertaining and informative
on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
You are now entering the Stone Zone, and I'm Roger Stone, a grizzled veteran of 50 years in the political battles of the United States. I've spent all that time in the corroded rectum of the two-party system, and I've seen it all. Now, New York State is one of the few states in the country that has more than two established parties. New York State has the Republican Party, of course, the Democrat Party, the Working Families Party, and the Conservative Party. In order to win permanent status in New York State, a party has to get at least 50,000 votes in any given race for governor. The Conservative Party has a rich history. Of course, it was born back in the early 1960s when New York's Republican Party was dominated by liberal Republicans like Nelson Rockefeller, Senator Jacob Javits, and then Republican Congressman, later Mayor, John Lindsay. The party is, of course, stoutly pro-life, pro-Second Amendment, meaning pro-firearms rights, and supports tax cuts, and, of course, strongly supports President Donald Trump. This is going to become an issue in New York State because Bruce Blakeman, the Nassau County executive who has emerged as the Republican frontrunner for governor after the surprise withdrawal of upstate Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, is not pro-life. In fact, he's pro-choice. While that would make him probably a stronger general election candidate, it's going to be very hard to convince the state executive committee of the Conservative Party to support a candidate who is not pro-life. This is also playing out in the 21st district, way up by the Canadian border. That's the district where Elise Stefanik has announced that she will not be a candidate for re-election, and then surprised the political world by also announcing that she would not be a candidate for governor. Now, the businessman, Sticker Mule CEO Anthony Constantino has announced his candidacy for that seat. Constantino shocked the political world yesterday by dumping $5 million of his own money into his campaign for Congress. Constantino says that he will not fundraise, that he sees his self-funding of his campaign as leaving him free from the influence of special interests. In other words, Constantino will take no money from Big Pharma, from Wall Street, from the big banks, oil companies, and others who are major players on the political scene. But in the meantime, former Congressman Mark Molinaro is openly exploring a run for that very same seat. Now, this is strange because Molinaro is a former Dutchess County executive and former congressman from New York's 19th Congressional District, which is in the Mid-Hudson Valley, very far from this northern New York district. The state party conservative chairman, Gerald Cassar, announced that Molinaro had reached out to him about the possibility of entering the race for New York's 21st Congressional District and whether the Conservative Party could theoretically cross-endorse him. Molinaro currently serves in President Trump's administration as the Federal Transit Administration boss. He's had no comment on these reports that he's thinking of running for Congress. Assemblyman Robert Smullen, who unfortunately has been convicted of tax fraud, was also endorsed recently by the Franklin County Republican Party up in that district, the 21st. He is yet another contender along with Anthony Constantino. Constantino, who's the owner and founder of Sticker Mule, a printing and packaging supply company, has already announced his candidacy. Molinaro's potential entry into the race has already raised serious political, ideological, and residency questions among some local Republicans, according to the New York Post. Molinaro has no strong ties to the district and an expansive area that runs through 15 counties and borders both Vermont and Canada. This would be called carpetbagging in my business. Molinaro's career has been focused in Dutchess County, where he served as the mayor of Tivoli, a member of the Dutchess County Legislature, later Dutchess County Executive, and later as a one-term congressman representing the Mid-Hudson Valley and a few parts of upstate. He was also briefly the Republican candidate for governor in 2018, where he was also defeated. Molinaro lost his first House reelection bid to Democrat Congressman Josh Riley in 2024, as well as a rematch beyond his residency. Republican sources claim that Molinaro's record is too liberal, according to the New York Post, for some Republican primary voters in the conservative-leaning district. Molinaro, during the 2024 campaign, softened his opposition to abortion. He's quoted in the New York Post as saying, "I believe health decisions should be between a woman and her doctor, not Washington." He actually made a TV ad that said that. He also said he did not vote for Donald Trump in 2016, but did so afterwards, and he currently serves in a relatively low-level position in the Trump administration. One Republican source characterized Molinaro to the New York Post as a liberal and a failed politician who didn't even vote for Trump in 2016 and is now part of the D.C. elite trying to parachute into an upstate district that he has no connection to. Mark is asking, reportedly, for the president's support. There's another issue here that is problematic, and that is the fact that Molinaro is among those who took a knee supporting the Black Lives Matter movement after the death of George Floyd. That's not going to sit very well with Republican primary voters. So we're going to cover this race and watch it all play out, but there's the latest. $5 million put into his campaign by Anthony Constantino makes him the third best funded Republican House candidate in the country, meaning he has $5 million cash on hand in a rural district where Constantino was born and grew up, and where I believe he may be the single largest employer. He's going to be very hard to beat. Meanwhile, a woman was fatally shot by an ICE enforcement agent on Wednesday after she attempted to run over an agent in Minneapolis. This occurred when ICE agents were conducting lawful, targeted operations, and unfortunately, a deranged rioter attempted to run over officers, an act that the Department of Homeland Security correctly describes as domestic terrorism. An ICE agent, fearing for his life, fired at the woman in self-defense, killing her. Yet, instead of condemning violence against law enforcement, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey launched into a profanity-laced tirade demanding that ICE get the F out of Minneapolis and dismissing self-defense as BS, also blaming federal officials for a death caused because of criminal behavior motivated by Trump derangement syndrome. Mayor Frey's rhetoric poured gasoline on a fire, signaling to agitators that those who attack federal agents will be coddled by the system in Democrat-run cities. Even more disturbing was the response from Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who flatly accused the Department of Homeland Security of lying, despite posting video evidence herself showing that the suspect reversing and then driving forward towards an agent standing directly in front of her vehicle. Omar deliberately released disinformation, putting more ICE officers at risk. This incident comes amid the largest Department of Homeland Security enforcement operation ever launched in Minnesota under President Donald Trump and the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, aimed at dismantling fraud and removing violent criminals. This level of enforcement is necessary because, well, Democrat leaders have frankly gone insane. They're actually excusing violence, lying about evidence, and inciting chaos. Minneapolis isn't suffering from ICE, it's suffering from leaders who care more about Marxist subversion than improving public safety. The Trump White House, in the meantime, has launched a new webpage aimed at setting the record straight regarding January 6, 2021, challenging years of media spin and partisan revisionism pushed by Democrats and their allies. Titled January 6th, a date which will live in infamy, the White House posted page notes that the chaos at the Capitol was not the result of an insurrection, but of catastrophic security failures overseen by then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. According to the administration, newly highlighted evidence, including previously unaired HBO footage filmed by Pelosi's own daughter, show Pelosi admitting, quote, "We have totally failed," and taking, quote, "full responsibility," unquote, for failing to deploy the National Guard, despite intelligence warning and offers by President Donald Trump to provide National Guardsmen. The mayor of D.C. and Speaker Pelosi have continued to deny that such an offer was made, but the now FBI director, Kash Patel, has posted online the specific letter sent to the mayor of D.C. and copied to Pelosi, offering to supply National Guardsmen to secure the peace and security on January 6th. In December of 2024, interim House report further exposes the Pelosi-led January 6th Select Committee for their blatant partisanship, including the deletion of over a terabyte of data and the coaching of witnesses whose claims were later contradicted by Secret Service testimony. The webpage also underscores that President Trump explicitly called on supporters to act peacefully and patriotically, a fact long ignored by Democrats, but it was made much easier by the fact that President Trump's specific online social media post in which he says that was banned on all major social media. As the new website posted by the White House notes, no evidence ever emerged of an armed rebellion or a coordinated plan to overthrow the government. Instead, the administration argues, Democrats weaponized January 6th to distract from election irregularities, crush dissent, and expand federal power. In a decisive act of justice, President Trump pardoned or commuted the sentences of nearly 1,600 Americans on January 20th, 2025, many of whom were overcharged, denied due process, and held in the worst possible conditions as political prisoners. In fact, many of them were held in conditions which violate the Geneva Conventions. That's a national treaty to which the United States has agreed. The page closes by honoring 9 individuals who lost their lives in connection with January 6th, including the iconic martyr, Ashley Babbitt. Ashley Babbitt was a decorated Air Force veteran who was shot and killed in cold blood by Capitol Police Officer Michael Byrd. What's interesting here is that Babbitt was not armed. Babbitt was menacing no one, was a threat to no one, and she was shot and killed without warning. So I say thank God to President Trump for finally setting the record straight about what happened on January 6th. I was among those they tried to victimize. I want to make it clear one more time. Any claim that I knew in advance about, participated in, or condoned any illegal action on January 6th, or any other date for that matter, is categorically false. The January 6th Select Committee, which did not have any Trump supporters on it. The 2 Republicans appointed to the committee were anti-Trumpers, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, both of whom did not run again. In the case of Liz Cheney, defeated in the Republican primary in Wyoming by a record margin. And in the case of Kinzinger, he actually wisely retired. I'm Roger Stone. You're listening to the Stone Zone right here on the Red Apple Audio Networks, and we'll be back with more political news on the other side. So whatever you do, please don't go away. We'll be right back.
The Stone Zone, entertaining and informative.
On the Red Apple Podcast Network.
And we're back in the Stone Zone, and I'm your host, Roger Stone. Federal immigration authorities have launched what the Department of Homeland Security is calling its largest enforcement operation ever, focusing on the scourge of Somalis in Minnesota. The sweeping operation follows a massive welfare fraud investigation that has seen the Somali community siphon billions of dollars of tax money illicitly through various healthcare, childcare, and charity scams. Backed by President Donald Trump and the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, federal law enforcement has been mobilized to eradicate fraud and restore public safety. According to DHS Assistant Secretary Tricia McLaughlin, more than 1,000 dangerous criminals, including murderers, rapists, pedophiles, and gang members, have already been arrested in Minnesota. Reports indicate roughly 2,000 Homeland Security personnel are being deployed, underscoring the seriousness of this new operation. The enforcement surge comes amid a sprawling welfare fraud scandal that has embarrassed Minnesota's political leadership, particularly outgoing Governor Tim Walz, who announced only days ago that he will not stand for re-election. It has also drawn international scorn. The Trump administration has been adamant that non-citizens found to be involved in the Minnesota fraud will face revoked citizenship and removal. In a video shared Tuesday, Secretary Noem highlighted the arrests of illegal immigrants in Minneapolis with active murder and sexual assault warrants in Ecuador, calling it another predator taken off the streets thanks to U.S. immigration and customs enforcement. Additionally, there are Medicaid fraud allegations now surfacing in places like Ohio and Washington state as well, with migrant communities at the core of those burgeoning scandals. We need to keep exposing this, but we also need to recognize the impact it is very likely to have on the 2026 elections. Those Republicans who are throwing in the towel on the midterm elections don't seem to understand that in American politics, a week can be a lifetime. This is going to be the biggest financial fraud scandal in U.S. history. My experience in politics indicates to me that nothing aggravates the hardworking, middle-class, tax-paying families more than the abuse of our tax dollars. Those who misunderstand the importance of this scandal and the fact that it could, in fact, dominate the 2026 elections, well, they really don't understand American politics. President Donald Trump recently warned the House Republicans that losing the midterms would hand Democrats the power to impeach him yet again, putting the impetus on Republicans to do a better job messaging about the many wins of the current administration. With the tragic death of Doug LaMalfa and the sudden departure of Marjorie Taylor Greene, and a razor-thin majority, Republican unity is more necessary than ever if Republicans actually intend to keep the House. If Republicans cannot unify to pass important legislation, the Democrats will capitalize because they are more unified. Trump explained, we've got to win the midterms because if we don't win the midterms, it's going to be, well, they'll find a reason to impeach me. I'll get impeached again. We don't impeach them. You know why? Because they're meaner than we are. We should have impeached Joe Biden for 100 different things. They're mean and they're smart, and unfortunately for the country, they have horrible policies. We have great, solid, common sense policy. They have horrendous policy. What they do is stick together. They never have a single no vote. I'm Roger Stone. You're listening to the Stone Zone. We've got more American politics on the other side, so please don't go away.
The Stone Zone, entertaining and informative.
On the Red Apple Podcast Network.
And we're back in the Stone Zone. President Donald Trump calling for unity among Republicans, but, well, there may be too many rhinos to actually achieve unity. Now, not everybody knows what a rhino is. Rhino, R-I-N-O, that stands for Republicans in name only. My own granddaughter asked me why I was talking about rhinoceroses on my radio show. No, rhino means Republican in name only. And unfortunately, the Republican House caucus has far too many of them. They are the real problem. The gutless, feckless, weak-kneed, lily-livered, country club belonging, white wine swilling, brie cheese eating country club Republicans who just don't want to fight for America. That's why I think we need America First warriors to run in Republican primaries, and they are the strongest candidates to win in the general election. There's never been a better time to step up. The ultimate lasting success of Donald Trump and his movement depends on whether they can make gains in the midterms. Now, it won't be easy. They are fighting against historical trends. We can only see that happen if there are strong candidates on the ballot. Again, we talked earlier in the show about what could be an epic struggle for New York's 21st district, where former Congressman Mark Molinaro, who served one term in Congress before being defeated, seems to be reaching for the seat of Elise Stefanik, who recently announced that she would not seek re-election, and then shocked the political world by also announcing that she would not run for governor. The most important things, as my good friend General Flynn always said, is the average citizen needs to get involved. Take the plunge, pick the candidates that you support, regardless of your party, and get out there and become part of the process. Meanwhile, Harmeet Dillon, the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights of the U.S. Justice Department, has formally put New York City's new socialist leadership on notice. Dillon warned that any policy from the new mayor, Zohran Mamdani, could discriminate against Americans on the basis of race, especially policies against white homeowners, will simply not be tolerated, no matter how it is dressed up in progressive rhetoric. Dillon said, just because you're white doesn't mean you have fewer rights in this country. We all have equal rights in our country and will not stand for New York City violating any federal law whatsoever. So they should be on notice. They are on high scrutiny, and we will swoop right in and do what is necessary to protect all citizens and taxpayers and all residents of New York, Dillon added. During Mamdani's campaign, a policy proposal about property taxes stated that his administration will, quote, shift the tax burden from overtaxed homeowners in the outer boroughs to more expensive homes in richer and whiter neighborhoods. His words, not mine. The warning comes amid growing concerns about policies advanced by New York City's new mayor, who openly campaigned on shifting the tax burden from overtaxed homeowners. His policy memo specifically targeted the most expensive Brooklyn brownstones for higher property taxes, language that raised immediate red flags regarding racial discrimination. Concerns intensified after the new mayor appointed Sia Weaver, a so-called tenant advocate, as his director of housing. Weaver has a documented history of radical statements, including claims that home ownership is a tool of white supremacy, and calls for seizing private property and replacing it with collective ownership, especially targeting middle-class white families. In resurfaced clips, Weaver openly argued that families, and her words, especially white families, must be forced into a fundamentally different relationship with their own property. The Trump administration must continue to keep their eye on Mamdani and be willing to take him to court and smack him down to reality, as he must understand that his sinister brand of race communism is against federal civil rights law and will not be tolerated under the U.S. Constitution. Meanwhile, Tuesday's Ukraine summit in Paris exposed a dangerous reality. Europe and NATO are actively prolonging the war between Russia and Ukraine, while sabotaging President Donald Trump's efforts to bring that war to a successful end. Hosted by French President Emmanuel Macron, the so-called coalition of the willing was less about peace and more about forcing permanent security guarantees for Ukraine that crossed Russia's clearly stated red lines. European leaders continue to push NATO protections for Ukraine, despite knowing full well that this is precisely what Moscow views as an existential threat. In fact, it's likely why Putin decided to launch his war in the very first place. Again, when the Russians agreed to the reunification of East and West Germany, the United States signed what is known as the Budapest Memorandum. That was an agreement with Russia, took place under President George H.W. Bush, signed by Secretary of State James A. Baker III, in which we very specifically agreed that we would not push Ukraine into NATO. In other words, we would not mount U.S. taxpayer-funded missiles on the ground in Ukraine pointed at Russia. I don't see how this is different than the situation in 1962 when the Russians mounted missiles on the Cuban Gulag 90 miles from our shore. And of course, America did not react well to that. Proposals for a ceasefire, monitoring, multinational reassurance forces, and post-truce military hubs are nothing more than NATO expansion under a different label. Whether officials admit it or not, this path risks pulling the United States into direct confrontation with a nuclear armed power. President Trump has been unequivocal on this issue for years. There must be no American troops in Ukraine and no reckless escalation towards World War III. Yet Europe appears determined to undermine his peace talks by seizing control of negotiations and attempting to strong-arm the Trump administration into following their lead. The presence of nose candy enthusiast Volodymyr Zelensky alongside dozens of European officials signals a coordinated effort to box the White House into commitments President Trump has repeatedly rejected. The rhetoric from London was particularly reckless. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer openly pledged troop deployments, military hubs, and long-term force regeneration inside Ukraine. From Moscow's perspective, none of these mechanics really matter. Vladimir Putin will see NATO soldiers, infrastructure, and weapons on Russia's border, exactly what his forces are fighting to stop. Instead of backing President Trump's sensible push for de-escalation, the European countries are doubling down on policies that extend the war, endanger global stability, and gamble with American lives. Peace will only be achieved through strength and diplomacy, not grandstanding, that inches this country closer and closer to World War III. It's time for President Trump to consider cutting off the spigot of aid to Ukraine once and for all. Meanwhile, President Trump is floating a proposal to revitalize Venezuela's oil industry by encouraging U.S. energy firms to invest in rebuilding the nation's crippled oil infrastructure with the help of American aid. Now, for those who say that his stunning late-night arrest of the Venezuelan strongman Nicolas Maduro was regime change or all about oil, well, they're partially right. By getting control of Venezuela's enormous oil reserves, it denies that oil to the communist Chinese. Now, the Russians have their own oil, but China relies heavily on Venezuela and takes about 80% of their production. President Trump has offered an ambitious timeline of having his program up and running in under 18 months. Some pessimistic estimates have stated that rebuilding the Venezuelan oil industry could take a decade and cost over $100 billion. But President Trump refuses to succumb to that negativity. Where there's a will, there's a way. And as President Trump showed over the weekend, there is no shortage of will from his administration. President Trump's efforts in Venezuela strengthen U.S. energy dominance while ensuring American taxpayers are not left on the hook for foreign reconstruction. Leveraging Venezuela's vast reserves to lower oil prices here at home and reduce foreign dependency makes strategic sense and can be done without embracing the open-ended nation-building failures of the Bush and Obama regimes. President Trump's willingness to explore creative approaches signals a strong revaluation of failed foreign policy orthodoxy, one that prioritizes American strength, our economic leverage, and ambitious timelines that help the people of the United States and Latin America as well. This is how we will dominate this hemisphere and make Americans great again. Meanwhile, Senator Rand Paul has exposed a deeply troubling abuse of federal power under the Biden administration, one that should alarm every American who values civil liberties and the rule of law. According to the Kentucky senator, the FBI used unverified and false tips to place innocent Americans on terror watch lists in the aftermath of January 6, actually weaponizing national security tools against political opponents. One of the most disturbing cases involved Christine Crowder, a Catholic schoolteacher who was never even at the Capitol. Crowder attended a Trump rally earlier that day, but was later falsely accused, based on nothing more than a tip from someone who thought they recognized her in news footage. Despite failing facial recognition and geolocation checks, the FBI allegedly subjected Christine Crowder and her family to nearly 2 years of surveillance, placed her on travel watch lists, obtained a warrant for her Facebook account, and even prepared a prosecution case. This is the sort of political persecution you expect to see operated by commissars in Soviet Russia or Nazi Germany, but not by law enforcement here in the land of the free. As Senator Rand Paul correctly stated, a free society cannot tolerate government agencies treating suspicion as guilt or using counterterrorism authorities to intimidate law-abiding citizens. Yet this is exactly what occurred under President Joe Biden's FBI, which abandoned basic standards of evidence and due process after stealing the 2020 presidential election and then using January 6th as their Reichstag fire to use the war on terror powers to go after American patriots. What happened to Christine Crowder, the Catholic, should not happen to any American. Her fundamental rights were abridged, and the federal goons who ordered the investigation ought to be put to justice themselves and stand trial for their violation of her constitutional rights. Meanwhile, Senator Lindsey Graham delivered a stark message to the mullahs in Tehran as nationwide protests entered their 11th day. If Iran's regime continues to murder its own people, President Donald Trump will take decisive action, even against Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei himself. Iran's clerical leadership has responded to mounting domestic discontent with lethal force, prompting demonstrators all throughout the large country to chant death to Khomeini, with many of them appealing directly to the United States for protection. Now, Senator Graham, who supported many wars and international interventions throughout his career in politics, is certainly not wrong in this case. Americans under President Trump refuses to stand by as tyrants slaughter their own citizens. As shown in Venezuela with Maduro, he can remove a leader without nation-building efforts in a flash without causing much collateral damage. You see, that's why it's not regime change. No boots on the ground, no American fatalities, no long-term commitments. President Trump has shown that he knows how to project American power in a limited way. It's what he did when he decided to launch the strikes that disabled the Iranian nuclear weapons development program. And then once again, in this law enforcement action, which is really what the arrest of Maduro was, backed by the U.S. military. Iran's ayatollahs have spent decades exporting terror and destabilizing the Middle East. President Trump has strengthened America's moral authority by showing solidarity with oppressed peoples risking everything for freedom. The Iranian regime should turn away from extremism and authoritarian thuggery, but it's all they really know. There's no other option for them at this point. This is why their rule is growing illegitimate and inevitably will be ousted, not due to a foreign war effort, but because the people demand it. Senator Bob Torricelli, former member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, joined me last weekend right here on the Red Apple Audio Networks to discuss the ongoing crisis in Iran. But Torricelli was right when he said there is no U.S.-based invasion required. The clock is ticking on the Ayatollah and the radical Islamists who are clinging to power in Iran. Frankly, I think the entire system is about to collapse there without America having to do much. But the brave people of Iran, under this particularly brutal regime, where mass public executions have taken place, show enormous courage to stand up to the radical clerics. I'm Roger Stone. You're listening to the Stone Zone, and we'll be right back.
The Stone Zone, entertaining and informative.
On the Red Apple Podcast Network.
And we're back in the Stone Zone. I'm your host, Roger Stone. A federal appeals court has delivered a decisive win against demonic evil, rejecting an attempt by the Satanic Temple to use the courts to try to undermine Indiana's pro-life anti-abortion laws. The U.S. Court of Appeals in the Seventh Circuit upheld a lower court ruling saying that the group lacked standing to sue the state of Indiana, effectively shutting down a politically motivated legal stunt that could have had dire ramifications if it had been entertained. Writing for the court, Judge Doris Pryor made it clear that the Satanic Temple failed to meet even the most basic legal requirements to bring such a lawsuit. The group does not operate an abortion clinic in Indiana, has no plans to open one, and does not provide telehealth abortions in the state. Instead, it runs a telehealth abortion operation exclusively in New Mexico, but sought to extend those services in Indiana in direct violation of state law. The court rejected the Satanic Temple's attempt to claim association of standards based on vague statistics and hypothetical injuries, rather than identifying a single Indiana member actually harmed by the law. The group relied on speculative probabilities and broad ideological claims. As Judge Pryor noted, courts do not exist to resolve abstract grievances or political disagreements dressed up as a constitutional crisis. This decision affirms that religious freedom laws are not loopholes for abortion on demand, as the despicable Satanic Temple was claiming that abortion was a sacrament of their church and was protected under religious liberty laws. This ruling affirms that the states have the authority to protect life without being hijacked by radical lawfare campaigns. Meanwhile, all eyes on Greenland following the successful ouster of Maduro in Venezuela. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has reaffirmed what President Donald Trump has said all along, that acquiring Greenland is not a joke, a stunt, or some real estate fantasy. It's a serious national security matter. Rubio's comments to Congress underscore the administration's clear-eyed assessment that the Arctic is fast becoming the next arena of global competition, and America simply cannot afford to be passive while Russia and China make gains. Greenland's strategic location makes it indispensable to U.S. defense interests, with key Arctic sea lanes and also hosting critical early warning and missile defense infrastructure by the United States. And new shipping routes open in the Arctic, whoever controls the area, will shape global trade and security for decades. Think about this for a moment. A European colony here in our hemisphere? We have no colonies in the European hemisphere. Unlike previous administrations that deferred to European sensitivities, did not want to hurt the poor feelings of the people of Denmark, the Trump administration is prioritizing American interests first. The White House has made it clear that all options remain on the table. The preferred path, of course, is some kind of financial transaction, peaceful, lawful, and mutually beneficial. That approach reflects President Trump's business-minded realism to secure vital territory without endless wars or nation-building. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has rightly dismissed media mockery of the idea, noting that U.S. interests in Greenland have been discussed for generations. Franklin Roosevelt, of course, occupied Greenland during World War II. What has changed is the urgency. Foreign naval activity near Greenland's waters is no longer theoretical and waiting for approval from weak-kneed allies. Well, I think that's a recipe for disaster. Securing Greenland will strengthen America's Arctic dominance, protect the homeland, and send a clear signal that under President Donald Trump, the United States will never cede any ground to rival powers. I'm Roger Stone. You're listening to The Stone Zone, where 5 days a week we talk politics, and more politics. Thank you for joining us today in The Stone Zone. And until we meet again, God bless you and Godspeed.
Thanks for listening to The Stone Zone with Roger Stone. You can hear The Stone Zone with Roger Stone weeknights at 8 on 77 WABC. If you like the podcast, share it with your friends and listen anytime at WABCRadio.com and download the WABC Radio app. Hit that subscribe button on all major podcast platforms. Plus, follow WABC on social on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and X. See you next time for a new episode, so you never have to wonder.
What the heck is going on here?